Welcome to Myths of the Night. Ancient stories told in whispers to guide you into calm and peaceful rest. Here, the myths of old are retold in calm voices to help you rest, reflect, and dream. Imagine, if you will, a moment that would reshape the very fabric of Greek mythology. A single afternoon by the banks of the Eurotas River in ancient Sparta, where the boundary between divine desire and mortal vulnerability dissolved into something both beautiful and terrible. This is the story of Zeus and Leda, a tale that begins with transformation and ends with consequences that would echo through generations, sparking the greatest war the ancient world had ever known. Leda was no ordinary woman, though she walked the earth as a mortal. Born to King Theseus of Pleuron in Aetolia, she carried royal blood in her veins from birth. Her beauty was legendary, the kind that poets would struggle to capture in verse, with lustrous black hair that cascaded down her back like a midnight waterfall, and skin so fair it seemed to glow with an inner radiance. Ancient sources, particularly the Roman poet Ovid, would later describe her as having an almost otherworldly quality, a grace that marked her as someone touched by destiny, even before the gods took notice. When Leda married Tyndareus, the king of Sparta, it seemed her fate was sealed in the mortal realm. Tyndareus himself had an interesting story. He'd been exiled from Sparta by his brother Hippocoon, who seized the throne through force and violence. It was only through the intervention of the great hero Heracles that Tyndareus reclaimed his kingdom, after Heracles slew the usurper and his sons. This violent restoration of power set the stage for a reign that would be marked by both prosperity and divine interference. As Queen of Sparta, Leda embodied everything the position demanded. She was gracious, intelligent, and devoted to her husband and her city. Together, she and Tyndareus had already begun building their family, with daughters Timandra, Phoebe, and Philono gracing their palace halls. Life in the Spartan court moved with the predictable rhythm of royal duties, religious observances, and the raising of children. But the gods, as they so often do, had other plans. Zeus, the king of Olympus, the wielder of thunderbolts, the supreme deity who ruled over gods and mortals alike, possessed an appetite for beauty that knew no bounds. His wandering eye had caused countless troubles, both for himself and for the objects of his desire. His wife Hera, goddess of marriage and queen of the gods, was legendary for her jealousy and the creative punishments she devised for her husband's lovers. Zeus had learned, through painful experience, that subtlety and disguise were essential when pursuing mortal women. One day, as Zeus gazed down from Olympus upon the mortal realm, his attention fell upon Sparta. There, by the cool waters of the Eurotas River, he saw Leda. Perhaps she was taking a moment of solitude, escaping the demands of palace life. Perhaps she was supervising servants as they washed clothes in the river's current. The specifics vary across different ancient sources, but what remains consistent is the moment Zeus decided he must have her. But how to approach without alerting the ever-watchful Hera? Zeus was nothing if not creative in his seductions. He had appeared to Europa as a magnificent white bull, to Danae as a shower of gold, to Antiope as a satyr. For Leda, he chose a form that would inspire compassion rather than fear, that would allow him to get close without arousing suspicion. Zeus transformed himself into a swan. Not just any swan, but a creature of extraordinary beauty. Its feathers so white they seemed to capture and reflect light itself, its form graceful and elegant. According to the most widely accepted version of the myth, Zeus orchestrated an elaborate deception. He arranged for an eagle, perhaps one of his own sacred birds, or possibly even Hera, transformed to lend authenticity to his ruse, to pursue the swan with apparent murderous intent. Picture the scene. Leda stood by the river's edge, perhaps trailing her fingers through the cool water, when suddenly the air filled with the sound of beating wings. A magnificent white swan burst from the reeds, clearly terrified, with a massive eagle in hot pursuit. The swan's distress was palpable, its honking cries conveying pure panic. It flew directly toward Leda, the only refuge in sight. Now, Leda's compassion was genuine, her instinct to protect a helpless creature immediate and unquestioning. As the swan tumbled into her arms, she cradled it protectively against her breast, shielding it with her own body from the predator above. The eagle circled once, twice, then flew away. Its purpose served. Leda remained by the river, holding the trembling swan, soothing it with gentle words and soft touches. It was in this moment, this space of vulnerability and compassion, that Zeus revealed his true nature. Or rather, he didn't reveal it at all. Instead, while still in swan form, he consummated his desire. The ancient sources are somewhat divided on the exact nature of this encounter. Some, particularly later Renaissance artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Rubens, depicted the scene with a romanticized quality, showing Leda embracing the swan willingly, even affectionately, as though this were a consensual union. But we must be clear about what the older texts actually describe. The Greek writer Hyginus places this event specifically near the river Eurotas and describes it as Zeus taking advantage of Leda's compassionate nature. The god, in his animal form, essentially assaulted her. This was not seduction in any modern sense of the word. It was divine power, overwhelming mortal agency, leaving Leda with no choice in the matter. The encounter was brief, but world-changing. When it ended, Zeus flew away, leaving Leda confused, shaken, and fundamentally altered. She returned to the palace in a daze, unable to fully process what had just occurred. How does one explain such an experience? How does one reconcile the violation of being used by a god with the honor that Greek culture associated with divine attention? That very same night, Leda lay with her husband Tyndareus. Whether this was by chance or by divine design, the result was a dual conception that would become one of the most unusual in all of mythology. Two fathers, one divine and one mortal, for children conceived on the same night. This detail is crucial to understanding everything that follows, for it explains the mixed nature of Leda's offspring, some fully mortal, some touched by divine immortality. Leda said nothing to her husband about the encounter by the river. How could she? Who would believe such a tale? And even if believed, what king would accept that his wife had been claimed by Zeus himself? The silence she maintained was perhaps necessary for survival, but it also meant she carried this secret alone, watching as her body began to change in ways that defied all natural explanation. As the weeks passed, Leda realized she was pregnant, but this pregnancy was unlike anything experienced by mortal women. Her belly swelled, not with the normal roundness of children growing within, but with something harder, more solid. When the time came for her to give birth, she did not deliver babies in the conventional sense. Instead, in a chamber of the Spartan palace, attended by midwives sworn to secrecy, Leda laid 2 eggs. The image is almost absurd if we approach it literally. Eggs, large, substantial eggs with shells that gleamed with an otherworldly sheen. One egg was slightly larger than the other, both of them far beyond the size of any bird's egg, but smaller than one might imagine for containing human children. The midwives, veteran attendants who had seen countless births, stood in shocked silence. This was a clear sign of divine intervention, proof that something far beyond normal human experience had occurred. Leda, exhausted from her unusual labor, looked at these eggs with a mixture of wonder, fear, and a mother's instinctive protectiveness. Whatever was inside them was part of her, whatever their origin. She ordered the eggs to be kept safe and warm, tended constantly until they should hatch. The palace staff, bound by loyalty and terror in equal measure, obeyed. After all, how often does one assist in the birth of divine offspring? The eggs did not hatch immediately. Days stretched into weeks, and the entire palace held its breath, waiting to see what would emerge. Leda visited them constantly. Some accounts say she kept them in a special chest in her chambers, protected from prying eyes and potential harm. King Tyndareus, if he knew the truth of their origin, said nothing. Perhaps he understood that some mysteries of the gods were better left unquestioned. Perhaps he chose willful ignorance over dangerous truth. During this waiting period, rumors must have spread through Sparta. Palace servants talk, and the story of a queen laying eggs instead of bearing children in the normal way was too extraordinary to remain completely secret. Some Spartans might have viewed this as a blessing, proof that their royal family enjoyed divine favor. Others might have whispered darker interpretations, worried about what such unnatural births portended for the kingdom's future. Then came the day of hatching. The ancient sources differ on the exact details. Some say both eggs cracked open on the same day, while others suggest different timing. But the result was the same. From the egg or eggs emerged 4 children who would change the course of Greek mythology. The most common version tells us that Helen and Pollux came from one egg, while Castor and Clytemnestra emerged from the other. 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, all of them apparently healthy and whole, crying with the lusty vigor of any newborn. But here was the crucial division that would define their entire lives. Helen and Pollux were the children of Zeus, bearing within them divine blood and all the gifts and curses that came with it. Castor and Clytemnestra were the children of Tyndareus, fully mortal, destined for the normal span of human life. This mixed parentage, this division within a single gen of quadruplets, created a unique situation in Greek mythology. The distinction wasn't immediately apparent, of course. As infants, all 4 seemed remarkably similar. They were beautiful babies, even more so than usual, with a glow about them that suggested their extraordinary origins. Helen, even as an infant, possessed a beauty that made those who looked upon her pause and marvel. Her features were perfect in a way that transcended normal human attractiveness. Pollux showed signs of unusual strength and vigor, while Castor and Clytemnestra, though mortal, were still exceptional specimens of humanity. Tyndareus officially claimed all 4 as his own children. This was essential for their legitimacy and for maintaining the stability of his rule. Publicly, They were the princes and princesses of Sparta, born from the union of king and queen. Only a select few knew the full truth of their origin. This dual identity, public and private, mortal and divine, would follow the children throughout their lives. The household dynamics must have been complex. How does one raise children who are simultaneously siblings and yet fundamentally different in nature? The mortal children, Castor and Clytemnestra, would age and eventually die like any human. The divine children, Helen and Pollux, carried immortality in their veins, or at least the potential for it. This wasn't a difference that manifested immediately, but it cast a long shadow over their childhood. Leda proved to be a devoted mother to all four. Whatever trauma she'd experienced at the river Eurotas, whatever confusion or anger she might have felt about being used by Zeus, she channeled into fierce maternal love. She supervised their education, ensured they learned the skills appropriate to their stations. The boys trained in warfare and athletics, as befitted Spartan princes. The girls learned the arts of household management, diplomacy, and the subtle powers that royal women wielded in Greek society. As the children grew, their distinct personalities emerged. Helen's beauty only intensified with age, becoming almost supernatural in its power over those who beheld her. Even as a young girl, she turned heads wherever she went. Men would stop mid-sentence when she entered a room. Women regarded her with a mixture of admiration and envy. This kind of beauty was dangerous, a weapon as powerful as any sword, though Helen herself was initially unaware of the effect she had on others. Pollux, whose Greek name was Polydeuces, showed an early aptitude for boxing and physical combat. He was stronger than boys twice his age, faster, more coordinated. His divine heritage manifested in physical prowess that clearly set him apart from normal mortals. Yet he remained modest about his abilities, perhaps because his twin brother Castor was always by his side. Castor, though mortal, was himself an exceptional young man. He became renowned as a master of horsemanship, one of the finest riders Sparta had ever produced. The bond between Castor and Pollux was extraordinary, a connection that went beyond typical sibling affection. They were inseparable, completing each other's sentences, moving in uncanny coordination. The fact that one was mortal and one divine seemed irrelevant to them. They were brothers, twins, two halves of a whole. Clytemnestra developed differently from her siblings. While not possessing Helen's impossible beauty, she was still striking, with a sharp intelligence and a strength of will that would serve her both well and poorly in the years to come. She observed the world around her with calculating eyes, learning early that power in Greek society flowed through different channels for women than for men. She would need to be clever, ruthless even, to secure her own fate. The children's divine heritage remained a closely guarded secret, known only to a trusted few within the palace. As far as the wider Greek world was concerned, these were simply the extraordinary children of King Tyndareus and Queen Leda. And extraordinary they were, even without the divine connection. Their reputation spread beyond Sparta's borders. People whispered about the beauty of Leda's daughters, the prowess of her sons. Zeus, watching from Olympus, must have felt a certain satisfaction. These were his children, whether acknowledged publicly or not. He'd created something remarkable, as he so often did when he mingled his divine essence with mortal women. But Zeus, for all his power, couldn't foresee all the consequences of his actions. He couldn't know that the beauty he'd helped create in Helen would eventually tear the Greek world apart. Hera, too, watched, and one wonders about her reaction. She was the goddess most wronged by Zeus's endless infidelities, yet curiously, she never directly punished Leda or her children. This is remarkable because Hera's vengeance against Zeus's lovers was legendary. She'd tormented Io, driven Semele to destruction, and persecuted Heracles throughout his life. But Leda escaped relatively unscathed, and her children were allowed to grow and thrive without divine interference. Perhaps Hera felt that Leda was more victim than willing participant in Zeus's scheme. Perhaps the use of the swan disguise somehow made the whole affair less offensive to her. Or perhaps she recognized that these 4 children, especially Helen, would bring about consequences far more devastating than anything she could devise. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply allowing fate to run its course. As the children approached adolescence, the question of their futures became pressing. Marriages needed to be arranged, alliances forged, destinies determined. For Castor and Pollux, the path seemed relatively clear. They would become heroes, adventurers, defending Sparta and earning glory through their deeds. They would join expeditions like the voyage of the Argonauts and the Caledonian boar hunt, proving themselves among the greatest heroes of their generation. But for the girls, particularly Helen, the future was far more complicated. Helen's beauty had reached legendary status by her teenage years. She wasn't just beautiful in the normal sense. She was the most beautiful woman in the world, or so everyone who saw her agreed. This wasn't subjective opinion, but observable fact. Her beauty transcended normal human attractiveness and entered the realm of the divine, which made sense given her parentage. This level of beauty was both blessing and curse. It made Helen valuable beyond measure, a prize that any king would want to claim. But it also made her dangerous. Men would do anything to possess her, fight wars, betray allies, destroy cities. The marriage of Helen would be one of the most significant political events of the age, with ramifications that no one could fully predict. Tyndareus, wise in the ways of politics, recognized the danger. Every powerful man in Greece would want to marry Helen. Refusing any of them could create enemies, yet she could only marry one. How could he possibly navigate this situation without triggering conflicts that would tear Greece apart? The answer he devised would become known as the Oath of Tyndareus, a clever solution that seemed brilliant at the time, but would ultimately guarantee that Helen's marriage would lead to the bloodiest war in Greek mythological history. Before we move to that crucial moment, though, we should understand what life was like for these 4 siblings in those golden years before everything changed. They were young, beautiful, talented, surrounded by luxury and privilege. Castor and Pollux went on adventures together, always returning with new stories of heroism and narrow escapes. Helen learned to navigate the treacherous waters of being constantly observed and desired. Clytemnestra developed the steel core that would later make her both formidable and terrifying. Leda watched her children with a mixture of pride and foreboding. She knew their heritage, understood that they were marked by destiny in ways that ordinary mortals were not. She'd given birth to heroes and legends, but she'd also given birth to tragedy. That encounter by the river Eurotas, that moment when a swan sought shelter in her arms, had set in motion events that would reshape the entire Greek world. The question was no longer if catastrophe would come, but when, and in what form, and who would survive it. Zeus and Leda, love and tragedy. Script continued. Helen's coming of age marked one of the most significant moments in Greek mythology, a turning point that would eventually lead to 10 years of devastating war. By the time she reached marriageable age, around 14 or 15 by ancient Greek standards, her beauty had become so legendary that suitors came from every corner of the Greek world. These weren't ordinary men seeking an advantageous marriage. These were kings, princes, and the most powerful heroes of the age, each one convinced that he deserved to claim the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife. The list of suitors reads like a catalog of Greek mythology's greatest names. There was Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, whose cunning would later prove instrumental in the fall of Troy. Ajax the Great, a warrior of tremendous size and strength, towering over other men like a god. Diomedes, the fierce fighter who would wound gods themselves on the battlefield. Idomeneus, king of Crete, wealthy and powerful. Patroclus, who would later die at Troy, and whose death would drive Achilles to his final rage. Philoctetes, the master archer who possessed the bow and arrows of Heracles. And of course, there were the brothers Agamemnon and Menelaus, sons of Atreus, both exiled from Mycenae, but destined to reclaim their birthright. Agamemnon, the elder, was already marked for greatness, a natural leader with the charisma and ruthlessness to command armies. Menelaus, though less forceful than his brother, possessed a good heart and genuine devotion that would serve him well in the trials to come. All these men came to Sparta bearing gifts of astonishing value. Gold worked into intricate jewelry, weapons forged by master craftsmen, horses bred from the finest stock, rare wines, exotic slaves, bolts of purple-dyed fabric worth fortunes. They competed with each other in displays of wealth and generosity, each trying to prove that he alone was worthy of Helen's hand. The palace at Sparta overflowed with treasures, testament to just how desperately these powerful men wanted to claim Zeus's daughter as their own. King Tyndareus found himself in an impossible position. Every one of these suitors was powerful, each one capable of causing serious trouble if rejected. Some of them ruled kingdoms with substantial military forces. Others were heroes with legendary reputations, men whom other warriors would follow into battle without question. To choose one meant offending all the others, potentially creating enemies who could threaten Sparta's security or form dangerous alliances against him. For months, Tyndareus delayed, claiming he needed time to consider each suitor's merits carefully. In truth, he was paralyzed by the political nightmare Helen's marriage represented. He consulted with advisors, performed sacrifices to the gods seeking guidance, but no solution presented itself. The suitors grew impatient, tensions rising as they remained in Sparta, eyeing each other with increasing hostility. It was Odysseus who provided the answer, though not out of pure altruism. The king of Ithaca had come to Sparta ostensibly as a suitor for Helen, but his real interest lay elsewhere. He'd fallen in love with Penelope, daughter of Tyndareus's brother Icarius. Recognizing that he had no real chance of winning Helen's hand against such formidable competition and lacking the wealth to compete with richer suitors, Odysseus made a bargain with Tyndareus. He would solve the suitor problem in exchange for Tyndareus's support in winning Penelope. Tyndareus, desperate for any solution, agreed immediately. Odysseus gathered all the suitors together and proposed something that seemed simple but was actually brilliant in its implications. Before Tyndareus made his choice, all the suitors would swear a solemn oath. They would vow to respect whatever decision Tyndareus made, to honor the chosen husband, and most crucially, to come to that man's aid if anyone ever tried to steal Helen away from him. The oath was binding in the most serious way possible. It was sworn on pieces of a sacrificed horse, a ritual that invoked the gods themselves as witnesses. Anyone who broke this oath would face not just mortal consequences, but divine punishment as well. The suitors, confident in their own chances, and perhaps not fully thinking through the implications, all swore willingly. Each one imagined he would be the chosen husband, protected by the oaths of all the others. None of them realized they were essentially guaranteeing that if anything happened to Helen, all of Greece would go to war to retrieve her. With the oath secured, Tyndareus could finally make his choice without fear of immediate retaliation. And surprisingly, he didn't choose the most powerful or the most famous. He chose Menelaus, though some sources say Helen herself made the choice. The reasons varied depending on which ancient source you consult. Some say Menelaus was Helen's own preference, that there was genuine affection between them. Others suggest it was a strategic choice, allying Sparta with the exiled princes of Mycenae, who were destined to reclaim their kingdom. According to some accounts, Menelaus didn't even come in person, but was represented by his brother Agamemnon. Agamemnon, though he didn't win Helen, would marry her sister Clytemnestra, further cementing the alliance between the two royal families. Helen's wedding to Menelaus was one of the grandest celebrations Sparta had ever seen. Kings and heroes who'd competed for her hand attended, maintaining their oaths even in disappointment. There was feasting, athletic competitions, sacrifices to the gods. Helen, dressed in the finest garments, adorned with jewelry worth kingdoms, stood beside her new husband as they were blessed by priests and celebrated by all of Greece. But even on that joyous day, shadows loomed. Because while the Greeks celebrated, another set of events was unfolding on Mount Olympus that would have dire consequences for this newlywed couple. The gods were hosting a wedding of their own, the marriage of the sea nymph Thetis to the mortal king Peleus. It should have been a glorious occasion. All the Olympians gathered to celebrate. But there was one goddess who hadn't been invited. Eris, the goddess of discord and strife, was deliberately excluded from the guest list. The gods knew her presence would cause trouble, so they thought it safer to leave her out entirely. This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Furious at the slight, Eris appeared at the wedding anyway, uninvited and unannounced. She tossed a golden apple into the midst of the celebration, and on this apple were inscribed 3 simple words: "To the fairest." 3 goddesses immediately claimed the apple: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Each believed she was obviously the fairest, and therefore the apple belonged to her. The argument that erupted threatened to tear Olympus apart. Zeus, wise enough to know he couldn't judge this contest without making enemies, declared that they needed a mortal to make the decision. And the mortal he chose was Paris, a prince of Troy who was shepherding flocks on Mount Ida, unaware of his royal heritage. The 3 goddesses appeared before Paris, each one attempting to bribe him. Hera offered him political power, dominion over all of Asia. Athena offered victory in battle, military prowess that would make him the greatest warrior in the world. But Aphrodite offered something more immediate and tantalizing. She offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. She offered him Helen. Paris, young and foolish, and thinking with something other than his brain, chose Aphrodite. In that moment, Helen's fate was sealed, though she didn't know it yet. The goddess of love had just promised her to a Trojan prince, completely disregarding the small detail that Helen was already married. This divine promise would override mortal vows, setting in motion the events that would become the Trojan War. For a while, though, Helen knew nothing of this. She lived in Sparta as queen, by all accounts relatively happy in her marriage to Menelaus. They had a daughter together, Hermione, a beautiful child who inherited some of her mother's remarkable looks. Helen managed the palace household, participated in religious ceremonies, fulfilled all the duties expected of a Spartan queen. Menelaus, for his part, was a devoted husband, genuinely in love with his extraordinary wife. But that happiness couldn't last. Paris, having been promised the most beautiful woman in the world, needed to actually claim his prize. He came to Sparta on what was ostensibly a diplomatic mission. A prince of Troy seeking to establish friendly relations with the Greek kingdoms. Menelaus, who had no reason to suspect treachery, welcomed Paris as a guest with traditional Greek hospitality. The guest-host relationship was sacred in Greek culture, protected by Zeus himself. To violate it was one of the most serious crimes imaginable. What happened next is one of the most debated elements of the entire myth. Did Helen go with Paris willingly, falling in love with the handsome Trojan prince? Was she seduced by Aphrodite's divine influence, her feelings manipulated by the goddess who'd promised her to Paris? Or was she kidnapped, taken by force, while Menelaus was away on business? The ancient sources present all these versions, and perhaps the truth contains elements of each. Homer's Iliad, our oldest source for the story, suggests that Helen went willingly, but came to regret it later. She speaks with bitter self-recrimination about her choice, calling herself shameless and evil for abandoning her husband and daughter. Yet there are also hints that she wasn't entirely free to choose, that divine influence played a role in her decision. When she tries to resist Aphrodite later in the story, the goddess threatens her, reminding her that she has no real power to refuse the god's will. Imagine Helen's internal conflict. On one side, her duty to her husband, her love for her daughter, her position as Queen of Sparta. On the other, the overwhelming influence of Aphrodite, goddess of desire, combined with Paris's considerable charm. He was beautiful, young, exotic, offering adventure and passion that her settled, married life lacked. The goddess whispered in her ear, inflamed her desires, made staying in Sparta seem dull and provincial compared to the glories of Troy. One night, while Menelaus was away attending a funeral in Crete, Helen made her choice, or had it made for her. She left Sparta with Paris, taking with her considerable treasure from the palace, enough wealth to cause scandal even beyond the abandonment itself. They boarded Paris's ships and sailed away, heading east toward Troy. Some versions say she left her young daughter Hermione behind without even saying goodbye. Others claim she tried to take Hermione, but was prevented. When Menelaus returned to find his wife gone and his treasure plundered, his rage was absolute. But more than rage, he felt humiliation, betrayal, and devastating loss. He'd loved Helen genuinely, perhaps as much as any man in Greek mythology loved a woman. To have her stolen away by a guest he'd welcomed into his own home, to have that sacred hospitality violated so completely, it was an offense that demanded response. Menelaus immediately went to his brother Agamemnon in Mycenae. By this time, Agamemnon had reclaimed his kingdom with Tyndareus's help, killing the usurper Thyestes and establishing himself as the most powerful king in Greece. When Menelaus told him what had happened, Agamemnon saw not just a family crisis, but a political opportunity. This was a chance to unite all of Greece under his leadership, to launch a grand expedition that would establish his legacy for all time. Agamemnon sent messengers throughout Greece, reminding every man who'd sworn the oath of Tyndareus that they were bound to help retrieve Helen. Most came willingly. Some required persuasion or outright coercion. Odysseus famously tried to avoid the war by feigning madness, plowing his fields with salt and an ox and donkey yoked together. But Palamedes, another hero, placed Odysseus's infant son Telemachus in front of the plow. Odysseus immediately stopped, revealing his sanity, and was forced to join the expedition. The gathering of forces took time, years even. Warriors came from every corner of Greece and the Aegean islands. Over 1,000 ships assembled at the port of Aulis, ready to sail to Troy. It was the largest military force ever assembled in the Greek world, all for one woman. Helen's beauty had indeed launched 1,000 ships, though Christopher Marlowe's famous line wouldn't be written for centuries yet. But before the fleet could sail, the gods demanded a price. The goddess Artemis, angered by Agamemnon for killing one of her sacred deer and boasting about it, caused the winds to die completely. The fleet sat becalmed, going nowhere, supplies dwindling, men growing restless. The seer Calchas revealed that Artemis demanded a sacrifice. Agamemnon's own daughter, Iphigenia. Here, Helen's sister Clytemnestra enters the story more directly. Iphigenia was her daughter, and Agamemnon, without consulting his wife, sent word that Iphigenia should come to Aulis because he'd arranged for her to marry the great hero Achilles. It was a lie. When Iphigenia and Clytemnestra arrived, they discovered the terrible truth. Some versions say Clytemnestra was present for the sacrifice, forced to watch as her daughter was killed. Others say she learned of it only after Agamemnon had already sailed, the winds finally favorable after Iphigenia's blood spilled on the altar. This murder of Iphigenia, whether actual or believed to be real by those left behind, would have consequences that extended far beyond the war with Troy. Clytemnestra would never forgive her husband for sacrificing their daughter. The rage and grief she felt would fester during the 10 years Agamemnon was gone, ultimately leading to one of the most famous murders in all of Greek mythology. But that comes later in our story. For Helen, the war that bore her name must have been a source of incredible guilt and anguish. She became a prisoner in Troy, though a privileged one. The Trojans, particularly King Priam and his son Hector, treated her with respect despite the war she'd brought to their gates. She lived in Paris's palace, played the role of his wife, bore him children according to some accounts. But Homer's Iliad presents her as deeply ambivalent about her situation, filled with self-hatred and longing for her previous life. There's a fascinating scene in the Iliad where Helen watches the Greeks and Trojans prepare for battle from the walls of Troy. She points out the various Greek heroes to King Priam, who has no idea who these men are. When she sees Menelaus, her voice breaks with emotion. She speaks of him with regret and affection, a stark contrast to how she speaks about Paris. Later, when Aphrodite forces her to go to Paris's bed after he's been humiliated in battle, Helen resists, showing that whatever power Aphrodite wielded over her had its limits. The war raged for 10 years, the longest continuous military campaign in Greek mythological history. Thousands died on both sides. Great heroes fell one by one. Ajax by his own hand after being denied Achilles' armor. Patroclus killed by Hector. Hector then killed by Achilles. Achilles himself brought down by Paris's arrow, guided to the one vulnerable spot on his body. Finally, through Odysseus's cunning, the Greeks achieved victory. The Trojan horse, that masterpiece of deception, allowed Greek warriors to infiltrate Troy's impregnable walls. The city burned. King Priam was murdered at the altar. Paris was killed by a poisoned arrow. Helen's second husband, the man for whom she'd abandoned everything, was dead, and the city that had sheltered her was reduced to smoking ruins. When Menelaus finally found Helen amid the destruction, he reportedly raised his sword to kill her. But when he looked at her face, that legendary beauty that had started everything, he couldn't do it. In some versions, his anger simply dissolved, overcome by his lingering love. In others, Helen deliberately exposed her breasts, using her beauty as a weapon one final time to save her life. Either way, Menelaus decided to take her back to Sparta rather than execute her. The journey home took years more, plagued by storms and divine interference. When they finally reached Sparta, Helen resumed her role as queen, as though nothing had happened. Menelaus never reproached her, at least not publicly. They lived together for the rest of their lives, apparently reconciled, though one wonders what their private conversations were like, what guilt and recrimination lay beneath the surface of their public restoration. While Helen's story dominated the narrative of divine intervention's consequences, her brothers Castor and Pollux wrote their own legend, one defined not by beauty or tragedy, but by brotherly devotion so complete it transcended even death. The Dioscuri, as they were collectively known, from the Greek Dioskuroi, meaning sons of Zeus, became symbols of loyalty, heroism, and the bond between siblings that survives all challenges. From their earliest youth, Castor and Pollux were inseparable. Despite their different parentage, one mortal and one divine, they functioned as a single unit. Where other siblings might have developed rivalry or jealousy, particularly given Pollux's divine advantages, these brothers showed only mutual support and affection. They trained together, fought together, and shared every adventure that came their way. Castor, the mortal twin, became renowned as the greatest horseman in all of Greece. He could train horses that others considered untamable, ride animals that would throw any other rider, and understood equine behavior in ways that seemed almost supernatural despite his mortal nature. He developed techniques for breeding and training that would be used in Sparta for generations. In battle, he fought from horseback with devastating effectiveness, pioneering cavalry tactics that were revolutionary for the age. Pollux, blessed with divine strength and endurance, became the greatest boxer of his generation. His fists were like hammers, capable of crushing armor and breaking bones with single strikes. But more than just physical power, he possessed exceptional technique and strategy. He understood leverage, timing, and the vulnerabilities of the human body in ways that made him nearly unbeatable in close combat. Yet despite this fearsome ability, he was known for his mercy, often sparing opponents who others would have killed. Their first major adventure came when they were barely more than boys, joining Jason's expedition to retrieve the Golden Fleece. The crew of the Argo represented the finest heroes of their generation. Heracles, with his incredible strength, Orpheus, whose music could charm stones, Atalanta, the huntress, and dozens of others who would become legends in their own right. That Castor and Pollux were invited despite their youth speaks to their already considerable reputation. During the voyage of the Argonauts, the brothers proved their worth repeatedly. When the ship was beset by a terrible storm that threatened to sink them all, it was Pollux who kept the crew's spirits up, his divine vitality seemingly unaffected by the exhausting labor of rowing and bailing water. And when stars appeared on the heads of both brothers during the height of the storm, a phenomenon that came to be known as St. Elmo's fire, the sailors took it as a sign that the gods favored their voyage. The storm immediately calmed, and from that day forward, sailors throughout the Mediterranean would pray to the Dioscuri for protection during dangerous voyages. The brothers' most famous exploit during the Argonautic expedition occurred when the ship stopped at the land of the Bebryces. The king of that region, Amycus, was a brutal tyrant who forced all strangers to box with him. Amycus was enormous, a giant of a man with fists like boulders, and he'd killed countless travelers who'd had the misfortune to land on his shores. He demanded that one of the Argonauts face him in the ring, confident that he would add another victim to his tally. Pollux stepped forward without hesitation. The match was brutal, a clash between Amycus's raw power and savage technique against Pollux's divine speed and skill. For a while, it seemed the tyrant might actually win, his experience and sheer mass allowing him to land devastating blows. But Pollux's divine nature meant he could absorb punishment that would have killed a mortal boxer. He weathered the storm of Amycus's assault, waiting for his opening. When it came, Pollux struck with precision and power that was almost inhuman. A combination of blows to the body and head left Amycus reeling. And then a final uppercut shattered the tyrant's jaw and sent him crashing to the ground, dead before he hit the earth. The Bebryces, freed from their cruel king, welcomed the Argonauts with gratitude and celebration. Pollux had won more than a boxing match. He'd liberated an entire people from tyranny. After the Argonauts returned home with the Golden Fleece, Castor and Pollux continued their adventures. They participated in the Caledonian boar hunt, another gathering of Greece's greatest heroes, called together to kill a monstrous boar that was ravaging the region of Caledon. Though the final kill was attributed to Meleager and the huntress Atalanta, the Dioscuri played crucial roles in the hunt, herding the beast toward the fatal encounter and preventing it from escaping multiple times. But their most personal adventure, the one that revealed the depth of their devotion to family, came when they had to rescue their sister Helen. Before her marriage to Menelaus, when Helen was still a young girl, the Athenian hero Theseus kidnapped her. Theseus was past his prime by then, but still formidable, and he'd become obsessed with the idea of possessing the most beautiful woman in the world, even though Helen was far too young to be anyone's wife. Theseus hid Helen in the Attic town of Aphidna, placing her under the guard of his mother, Aethra. Meanwhile, he and his companion Piritaus went off on another mad adventure, attempting to kidnap Persephone from the underworld itself. This attempt at stealing Hades's wife went about as well as might be expected. Both heroes ended up trapped in the underworld, stuck to chairs of forgetfulness, facing eternal punishment for their hubris. While Theseus was thus occupied, Castor and Pollux came to Athens searching for their sister. Some versions say they had to lay siege to the city and engage in serious warfare before discovering Helen's location. Others suggest they used more subtle methods, infiltrating Athens to gather intelligence. Either way, when they found Helen in Aphidna, they rescued her and brought her home to Sparta. They also took Aethra with them as a slave, a fitting punishment for the woman who'd helped keep Helen captive. This rescue mission accomplished something else as well. It established the Dioscuri as more than just adventurers seeking glory. They were protectors of their family, men who would face any danger to keep their loved ones safe. This reputation would serve them well throughout their lives, making them beloved figures throughout Greece and beyond. The brothers also served as diplomats and peacemakers when they weren't adventuring. Their reputation for fairness and their connection to divine authority made them natural mediators in disputes. They helped resolve conflicts between cities, mediated property disputes, and generally used their fame and status to promote peace and justice. This aspect of their legend is often overshadowed by their martial exploits, but it was equally important to their contemporaries. But even heroes as blessed as the Dioscuri couldn't escape tragedy forever. Their downfall came from a conflict with their cousins Idas and Lynceus, twin brothers from Messenia. Like many Greek tragedies, it started with something relatively minor and escalated into catastrophe. The four young men, two sets of twins, decided to conduct a cattle raid together in Arcadia. This wasn't unusual. Such raids were considered acceptable ways for young warriors to prove themselves and gain wealth. They successfully stole a large herd and prepared to divide the spoils equally among themselves. But Idas, known for his cunning and greed, proposed a different arrangement. Idas suggested they divide the cattle based on a contest. He slaughtered a cow and cut it into 4 pieces. Whichever pair of twins finished eating their portions first would get half the herd, and whoever finished second would get the other half. It seemed fair on the surface, but Idas was manipulating the situation. He and Lynceus were both enormous men with corresponding appetites, while Castor and Pollux, despite their heroism, were of more normal size. Idas and Lynceus devoured their portions with astonishing speed and claimed the entire herd before Castor and Pollux had even finished their shares. Technically, by the rules Idas had set, this was legitimate, but it was clearly a betrayal of the spirit of their partnership, using trickery to cheat their cousins out of their fair share. Castor and Pollux, outraged by this deception, demanded the cattle be divided properly. What might have been resolved through negotiation escalated into violence. The exact sequence of events varies between sources, but the result was deadly combat between the 2 pairs of brothers. Idas and Lynceus ambushed Castor and Pollux, hoping to eliminate them before they could respond. Lynceus, blessed with supernatural vision that could see through objects and across vast distances, spotted Castor hiding in a hollow tree and alerted his brother. Idas struck first, spearing Castor through the chest. The mortal twin fell, mortally wounded, his divine brother's worst nightmare come to life. Pollux, roaring with grief and rage, attacked with all his divine power. He caught Lynceus and killed him with his bare hands, breaking the man's neck in a grip fueled by supernatural strength and overwhelming emotion. But Idas, seeing his own brother dead, attacked Pollux with such fury that even the divine twin was hard-pressed to defend himself. The battle might have killed them both if Zeus hadn't intervened. The king of the gods, watching his son fighting for his life over his dying mortal brother, struck Idas down with a thunderbolt. The blast incinerated Idas instantly, leaving nothing but ash and the smell of ozone. But this divine intervention came too late for Castor, who lay dying in Pollux's arms. What followed is one of the most moving scenes in all of Greek mythology. Pollux, cradling his brother, begged Zeus to save him. He offered his own divine immortality in exchange for Castor's life. He offered to die in his brother's place. When Zeus explained that Castor's mortality couldn't be simply reversed, that death had a claim that even the gods couldn't completely overrule, Pollux made an even more extraordinary proposal. He asked that he and Castor share his immortality. Let them spend alternate days in different realms. One day among the gods on Olympus, the next in the underworld with the dead. They would never truly be together again, but at least they would both exist in some form, taking turns experiencing life and death. The love between them was so complete that Pollux preferred half immortality shared with his brother to full divine status alone. Zeus, moved by this devotion, agreed. But he went further. He placed the brothers in the heavens as the constellation Gemini, the twins, where they would shine together for all eternity. Every night, when people looked up at the stars, they would see Castor and Pollux side by side, brothers forever. A testament to love that transcended even the boundary between mortality and divinity. But the arrangement Zeus made had a beautiful symmetry to it that went beyond just the constellation. Each day, one brother would dwell on Olympus among the gods, while the other resided in the shadowy realm of Hades. Then they would switch, maintaining perfect balance. They would never again embrace, never again fight side by side, never again share their adventures in real time. But they would continue to exist, and they would know the other was safe, and perhaps that knowledge was enough. This sacrifice, this willingness to give up the full glory of divinity for the sake of a brother's continued existence, resonated deeply with Greek audiences. The Dioscuri became patron gods of brotherhood and loyalty, protectors of those bonds that tied family together through all hardships. Their cult spread throughout the Greek world and eventually to Rome, where they were known as Castor and Pollux and honored with festivals and temples. Sailors, in particular, venerated the twins. The phenomenon of St. Elmo's fire, that electrical discharge that makes ships' masts glow during storms, was seen as a sign of the Dioscuri's presence and protection. When that eerie light appeared, terrified sailors would offer prayers of thanks, knowing the divine twins were watching over them. To this day, Saint Elmo is the patron saint of sailors, a Christian adaptation of the much older cult of Castor and Pollux. In Sparta, their birthplace, the Dioscuri were especially honored. The Spartans, who valued martial prowess and brotherhood above almost everything else, saw in Castor and Pollux the embodiment of their ideals. Young Spartan warriors would swear oaths by the twins, asking for courage and strength in battle. The famous Spartan focus on paired bonds between warriors, where soldiers fought alongside partners they'd trained with since childhood, can be seen as drawing inspiration from the relationship between the Dioscuri. Of all of Leda's children, perhaps none has been more misunderstood, more vilified, and yet more compelling than Clytemnestra. While Helen's beauty sparked a war, and the Dioscuri became symbols of brotherly love, Clytemnestra's story is one of rage, betrayal, and a vengeance so complete it would consume not just her intended target, but herself and her entire family. Yet to understand Clytemnestra, we must resist the urge to view her simply as a villain. Her story is far more complex and tragic than that. Clytemnestra began life as the mortal daughter of Leda and Tyndareus, sister to the divine Helen and the twins Castor and Pollux. Growing up in the shadow of Helen's impossible beauty must have shaped her in ways the ancient sources rarely explore. Imagine being constantly compared to a sister whose looks transcended mortal standards, who attracted the attention of every man who saw her, who was clearly marked for a destiny larger than ordinary life. Clytemnestra developed different strengths: intelligence, strategic thinking, and a will of iron. According to some versions of the myth, preserved by ancient writers like Euripides, Clytemnestra was actually married once before Agamemnon entered her life. Her first husband was named Tantalus, a king variously identified as ruling either Pisa or Lydia, and either the son of Thyestes or of Proteus. This first Tantalus was apparently a good man, and Clytemnestra bore him a son. By all accounts, it was a happy marriage, the kind of stable, loving partnership that would have given Clytemnestra the life she wanted. Quiet and unremarkable perhaps, but her own. Then Agamemnon appeared, the exiled prince of Mycenae. He'd taken refuge in Sparta, along with his brother Menelaus. Both brothers were ambitious, ruthless, and determined to reclaim their birthright. Agamemnon, the elder, possessed a commanding presence and a personality that bent others to his will. When he saw Clytemnestra, he decided he wanted her, with no regard for the small detail that she was already married. What happened next reveals Agamemnon's character in ways that would echo through the rest of the story. He killed Tantalus. Then, to ensure there would be no rival for Clytemnestra's affections or claims on her loyalty, he killed her infant son as well. The murder of her child, ripped from her arms and slaughtered before her eyes, this was the foundation of Clytemnestra's second marriage. When King Tyndareus discovered what Agamemnon had done, he was naturally enraged. He came upon Agamemnon ready to execute justice for the murder of his son-in-law and grandson. But there's a detail in the myth that's both absurd and telling. Agamemnon was on his knees praying to the gods when Tyndareus found him. The king of Sparta, seeing this display of apparent piety, was so moved that he stayed his hand. Instead of killing Agamemnon, he agreed to let the murderer marry Clytemnestra. One has to wonder what Clytemnestra thought of this arrangement. She'd just lost her husband and child to this man, and now she was being forced to marry him. Whatever rage, grief, or horror she felt, she had no power to refuse. In Greek society, women were essentially property, passed from father to husband, with little say in their own fates. Clytemnestra became Agamemnon's wife, not by choice, but by her father's decree and her husband's violence. The marriage produced 4 children, 3 daughters named Iphigenia, Electra, and Chrysothemis, and 1 son, Orestes. Clytemnestra proved to be an effective queen of Mycenae when Agamemnon eventually reclaimed his throne. She managed the palace, oversaw the raising of their children, and fulfilled all the duties expected of her. But beneath the surface, one wonders what resentments were brewing. Did she ever look at Agamemnon with anything but carefully concealed hatred? Did she ever forget how this marriage began? Then came the Trojan War, precipitated by her sister Helen's abduction or elopement with Paris. Agamemnon, seizing the opportunity to lead the greatest military expedition in Greek history, assembled the fleet at Aulis. But as we've seen, the winds refused to blow, and the seer Calchas revealed that the goddess Artemis demanded a sacrifice. Iphigenia, Agamemnon's eldest daughter. What happened next represents one of the most heinous acts in all of Greek mythology. Agamemnon sent word to Mycenae that Clytemnestra should bring Iphigenia to Aulis. The stated reason was joyous. Iphigenia was to be married to Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age. What mother wouldn't leap at such an opportunity for her daughter? Clytemnestra came willingly, perhaps even eagerly, looking forward to seeing her daughter married to a hero. The truth, when it was revealed, must have been shattering. There was no marriage. Achilles knew nothing of the supposed engagement, and was furious when he learned his name had been used in such a deception. The sacrifice was prepared, the altar ready, the knife sharp. Different versions of the myth vary on what Clytemnestra knew and when. Some say Agamemnon told her the truth before the sacrifice, forcing her to watch as her daughter was led to the altar. Others suggest she discovered it only afterward, when it was too late to prevent. Imagine Clytemnestra's state of mind. Her first child, murdered by Agamemnon when claiming her as his bride. Now her eldest daughter, sacrificed by the same man to satisfy his ambition and curry favor with the gods. The daughter she'd carried in her womb, nursed at her breast, raised with love and care, killed like an animal, so that ships could sail. And for what? To retrieve her sister Helen, whose own choices or victimization had started this entire catastrophe. Some versions of the myth suggest that Artemis, moved by pity at the last moment, substituted a deer for Iphigenia and spirited the girl away to serve as her priestess in distant Taurus. But Clytemnestra didn't know this. As far as she was concerned, her daughter was dead, murdered by her own father, and she had been powerless to stop it. Agamemnon sailed away to Troy, leaving Clytemnestra to rule Mycenae in his absence. 10 years. That's how long the war would last. 10 years for Clytemnestra to nurse her grief and rage. 10 years to plan her revenge. Because, make no mistake, from the moment Iphigenia died, Clytemnestra was planning how to make Agamemnon pay for what he'd done. Into this situation stepped Aegisthus, Agamemnon's cousin, and a man with his own reasons to hate the king of Mycenae. Aegisthus was the son of Thyestes, who'd been part of the long-running feud in the house of Atreus. His own father had committed atrocities, and atrocities had been committed against him. Aegisthus saw in Clytemnestra a kindred spirit, someone else who'd been victimized by Agamemnon's ruthless ambition. Clytemnestra took Aegisthus as her lover. Was this purely strategic? A political alliance with someone who shared her desire for vengeance? Or was there genuine affection between them? Two wounded people finding solace in each other's company? The ancient sources suggest it might have been both. They became partners in every sense, ruling Mycenae together, sharing a bed, and planning the murder of the king. During those 10 years, Clytemnestra bore Aegisthus 2 children, a son named Aletes and a daughter called Erigone. she sent her son Orestes away to be raised elsewhere, perhaps to protect him from Aegisthus, or perhaps because she couldn't bear to look at Agamemnon's son and heir. Her daughters Electra and Chrysothemis remained in Mycenae, though Electra at least would come to despise her mother for her adultery and her obvious plans for murder. Finally, after 10 long years, word came that Troy had fallen. Agamemnon was coming home, victorious, laden with treasure and glory, and bringing with him a Trojan princess named Cassandra as his concubine and prize of war. Clytemnestra prepared her welcome carefully. She would play the part of the faithful wife one final time. When Agamemnon's ship arrived at Mycenae, Clytemnestra was there to greet him with every appearance of joy and devotion. She spread purple tapestries before him, the kind of luxury usually reserved for gods, and invited him to walk on them into the palace. Agamemnon initially hesitated, recognizing the hubris of such an act, but Clytemnestra's persuasion and his own pride won out. He walked into his palace on those purple cloths, committing the very act of arrogance that would seal his fate. Cassandra, the Trojan princess, cursed by Apollo to see the future but never be believed, tried to warn Agamemnon. She saw the blood that would be spilled, the murder that awaited them both. But no one listened to her prophecies. They never did. She followed Agamemnon into the palace, knowing she was walking to her death. The murder itself has become one of the most iconic scenes in Greek literature, particularly as portrayed in Aeschylus's tragedy Agamemnon. Clytemnestra insisted her husband take a bath after his long journey, a seemingly innocent and solicitous gesture. As Agamemnon relaxed in the warm water, Clytemnestra struck. She'd prepared a net or cloth. Some accounts say it was the very garment he'd worn when sacrificing Iphigenia. She threw it over him, entangling him so he couldn't fight back. Then she killed him. Different versions give the weapon as an axe, a sword, or a knife. Some say Aegisthus wielded the weapon while Clytemnestra held the net. But the most powerful versions have Clytemnestra herself striking the blows. 3 strikes she gave him. The first wounded him. The second weakened him further. The third killed him. Agamemnon, the great king, the leader of the Greek forces at Troy, the man who'd commanded thousands of warriors, died helpless and naked in his own bath. But Clytemnestra wasn't finished. Cassandra, who'd seen it all coming but couldn't prevent it, was next. Some sources suggest this murder was motivated by jealousy. Clytemnestra eliminating her husband's concubine. But I think it was more practical than that. Cassandra was a witness, a royal princess whose murder would be one more crime to add to the list. Better to eliminate her along with Agamemnon, leaving no one to immediately challenge the new order. After the murders, Clytemnestra didn't hide or flee. Like the lioness Aeschylus would later call her, she stood in the palace courtyard, gore-stained weapon still in hand, and proclaimed to the people of Mycenae that justice had been served. She explained about Iphigenia, about the sacrifice of an innocent child to satisfy a father's ambition. She declared that Agamemnon had gotten exactly what he deserved. The people of Mycenae, shocked by the murder of their king, but perhaps also understanding Clytemnestra's grievance, didn't immediately revolt. Aegisthus and Clytemnestra assumed joint rule of the kingdom, presenting themselves as the new order. For 7 years, they ruled together, and by some accounts, they ruled well. The kingdom prospered, the people were fed, justice was administered. But the curse of the house of Atreus wasn't satisfied with one murder. The cycle of violence that had plagued this family for generations demanded more blood, and that blood would come from the most painful source possible: Clytemnestra's own son. Orestes, who'd been sent away as a boy, grew to manhood in exile. He was raised by King Strophius of Phocis, far from Mycenae and the murderous intrigue of his family. There, he formed a deep friendship with Strophius's son, Pylades, a bond that would sustain him through the horrors to come. As Orestes matured, he learned the truth about his father's death and his mother's crime. More than that, he received a divine command. The god Apollo, speaking through his oracle at Delphi, ordered Orestes to return to Mycenae and avenge his father by killing both Aegisthus and his mother, Clytemnestra. This put Orestes in an impossible position. Greek culture demanded that sons avenge their father's murders, but it equally condemned matricide as one of the worst crimes imaginable, an offense against the natural order itself. Orestes, driven by divine command and his sense of duty to his father, chose vengeance. He returned to Mycenae in secret with his friend Pylades and his sister Electra, who'd never forgiven their mother for Agamemnon's murder. Together, they plotted the deaths of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. The murders were accomplished through deception. Orestes pretended to be a messenger, bringing news of his own death, gaining entrance to the palace. When Aegisthus appeared, Orestes killed him. Then came the hardest part, facing his mother. The scene of Clytemnestra's death is one of the most dramatically powerful in Greek tragedy. When she realized what Orestes intended, She didn't beg for mercy based on her innocence or her royal status. Instead, she bared her breast, the breast that had nursed him as an infant, and asked if he could really strike his own mother. For a moment, Orestes hesitated, but Pylades reminded him of Apollo's command, and Orestes struck. Clytemnestra died, killed by her own son, just as she'd killed her own husband. But unlike her, who'd proclaimed her act as justice, Clytemnestra cursed Orestes with her dying breath. She called upon the Furies, the Erinyes, ancient goddesses of vengeance who punished those who committed crimes against family. And the Furies answered. From the moment of his mother's death, Orestes was pursued by these terrifying beings. They appeared as hideous hags with snakes for hair, bat wings, and blood dripping from their eyes. Only Orestes could see them, but their psychological torment was real enough. They drove him to madness, haunting his every waking moment and tormenting his dreams. He wandered Greece as a fugitive, unable to find peace anywhere. The question of Orestes' guilt became a matter for divine judgment. Eventually, at Apollo's instigation, a trial was held in Athens. The goddess Athena presided, with a jury of 12 Athenian citizens to decide Orestes' fate. Apollo argued for Orestes' acquittal, claiming that he'd acted under divine orders, and that matricide was justified to avenge a father. The Furies argued for conviction, insisting that no cause could justify the murder of one's mother. The jury was split evenly, 6 for conviction and 6 for acquittal. Athena, as the presiding judge, cast the deciding vote. She voted for acquittal, establishing the principle that when votes are tied, the accused should be freed. Orestes was absolved of his crime. The Furies were transformed into the Eumenides, or kindly ones, and the curse on the house of Atreus finally ended. But what of Clytemnestra herself? Even in death, she remained a controversial figure. Was she a villain, a murderess who betrayed her husband and kingdom for revenge and lust? Or was she a victim who'd been pushed beyond endurance by the men in her life, forced into marriage with her family's killer, and then driven to murder by the sacrifice of her innocent daughter? The ancient sources themselves can't agree. Aeschylus, in his Orestia trilogy, portrays her as formidable and frightening, but not unsympathetic. He makes clear that her grievance against Agamemnon was justified, even if her method of seeking justice was extreme. Homer, in the Odyssey, treats her more harshly, using her as a counterexample to the faithful Penelope. Modern retellings have increasingly sympathized with Clytemnestra, recognizing her as a woman with legitimate grievances, who was trapped by a patriarchal system that gave her no legal recourse for injustice. The sacrifice of Iphigenia, in particular, is seen as such a monstrous act that Clytemnestra's revenge becomes almost justifiable. She becomes not a villain, but a tragic figure. Someone who chose violence because all other options had been stripped away from her. The story of Zeus and Leda ripples outward through Greek mythology, like waves from a stone cast into still water, touching nearly every major narrative of the heroic age. That single afternoon by the river Eurota, that moment when a god disguised as a swan claimed a mortal queen, set in motion events that would reshape the ancient world. The children born from those two eggs became central figures in the greatest stories ever told, their lives and choices echoing through centuries of literature, art, and human imagination. Consider the scope of what flowed from this one union. Helen's face launched the Trojan War, a conflict that occupied the greatest heroes of Greece for a decade and ultimately led to Troy's destruction. That war forms the backbone of Homer's Iliad, one of the foundational texts of Western literature. Every major character in that epic, from Achilles to Hector, from Odysseus to Priam, exists in orbit around Helen, the woman whose beauty was so absolute it justified 10 years of bloodshed. The aftermath of the Trojan War generated more stories. Odysseus's 10-year journey home, chronicled in the Odyssey, begins because of the war fought over Helen. Aeneas's flight from burning Troy and his founding of Rome, told in Virgil's Aeneid, happens because Helen went to Troy with Paris. The tragedies of Euripides, Sophocles, and Aeschylus return again and again to the consequences of the Trojan War, exploring themes of pride, duty, revenge, and the relationship between mortals and gods. Clytemnestra's murder of Agamemnon spawned its own cycle of stories. The Oresteia trilogy by Aeschylus, arguably the greatest achievement of Greek tragic drama, follows the consequences of her revenge through 3 plays: Agamemnon, the Libation Bearers, and the Eumenides. These plays explore fundamental questions about justice, family obligation, and whether vengeance can ever truly be satisfied, or whether it simply perpetuates cycles of violence. The Dioscuri, though their individual stories are less extensively developed, became objects of widespread religious devotion. Their cult spread from Sparta throughout the Greek world and eventually to Rome, where they were known as Castor and Pollux and honored with a major temple in the Forum. Sailors prayed to them for protection, warriors invoked their names before battle, and their constellation, Gemini, became one of the most recognizable patterns in the night sky. Beyond the mythological narrative itself, the story of Zeus and Leda became one of the most frequently depicted subjects in ancient and later art. The image of Leda and the Swan captured artists' imaginations for millennia, allowing them to explore themes of beauty, vulnerability, divine power, and sexuality within a framework that classical mythology made acceptable. Greek and Roman artists created countless representations of the scene. Vase paintings from the 5th and 4th centuries BCE show Leda with the swan in various poses, sometimes tender, sometimes clearly depicting assault. Sculptures like the famous Capitoline Museum's statue show Leda embracing the swan, her expression ambiguous enough to allow multiple interpretations. Was she a willing participant or a victim? The art itself often doesn't provide clear answers, perhaps because the myth itself contains that ambiguity. During the Renaissance, when classical mythology experienced a revival, the story of Leda and the Swan became enormously popular with artists. Leonardo da Vinci created a painting of the subject, now lost but known through copies and preparatory sketches. His version apparently showed Leda standing with the swan, surrounded by their children emerging from eggs, an image that combined the erotic with the miraculous. Michelangelo also painted Leda and the Swan, creating a work of such sensuality that it caused scandal, even in relatively permissive Renaissance Italy. His version was reportedly destroyed by prudish owners in the 17th century, though again, copies survive. Michelangelo's Leda seems more actively engaged with the swan, an interpretation that emphasizes seduction over assault, but also raises questions about consent when one party is a god in disguise. Other Renaissance and Baroque artists tackled the subject with varying approaches. Tintoretto, Correggio, and later Peter Paul Rubens all created their own versions, each bringing their artistic style and interpretive choices to the myth. Rubens's version, painted in the early 17th century, is particularly notable for its lush sensuality, showing Leda in a moment that could be read as either ecstatic union or surrender to overwhelming force. The artistic tradition continued into modern times. In the 20th century, artists as diverse as Paul Cézanne, Georges Braque, and Salvador Dalí created works inspired by Leda and the Swan. Cy Twombly produced a series of abstract paintings based on the myth, while Sidney Nolan created multiple interpretations connecting the ancient story to modern Australian experiences and World War mythology. Literature, too, has returned repeatedly to this myth. William Butler Yeats's sonnet, Leda and the Swan, published in 1924, is perhaps the most famous modern literary treatment. Yeats's poem is stark and violent, making clear that this is an assault, not a seduction. The opening line, "A sudden blow, the great wings beating still," establishes the violent nature of the encounter immediately. Yet the poem also explores the idea that this moment of divine violation somehow imparted knowledge and power, asking whether Leda put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop. Yeats's poem sparked renewed interest in the myth and influenced many subsequent writers. The question of consent, largely glossed over in ancient sources, became central to modern retellings. Contemporary writers have increasingly portrayed Leda as a victim rather than a willing partner, reflecting changing attitudes about sexual assault and power dynamics. Recent decades have seen numerous novels and other works that retell the stories of Leda's children, often from the perspective of female characters previously relegated to supporting roles. Novels like The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, and 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes retell Trojan War stories from new angles, giving voice to characters like Helen, Clytemnestra, and Cassandra, who were often sidelined in male-authored narratives. These modern retellings tend to emphasize the humanity of the mythological figures, treating them as real people trapped in impossible situations, rather than as distant archetypal characters. Helen becomes not just the face that launched 1,000 ships, but a woman dealing with the burden of impossible beauty and the guilt of a war fought in her name. Clytemnestra becomes not simply a murderous queen, but a mother driven to extremes by the death of her daughter. Even Leda herself, often a cipher in ancient sources, is given more depth and agency in recent adaptations. The myth has also found its way into other art forms. Opera composers from the Baroque period onward have created works based on these stories. Gluck's Iphigenie en Aulide and Iphigenie en Tauride deal with the sacrifice of Clytemnestra's daughter and its aftermath. Richard Strauss's opera Electra tells the story of Orestes' revenge from his sister's perspective. These musical interpretations add emotional depth to the narratives, using the power of music to convey the psychological complexity of the characters. Modern music has also engaged with the myth. In 2022, Irish musician Hozier released a song called Swan upon Leda that explicitly uses the myth as a metaphor for reproductive control and bodily autonomy. Written in response to the United States Supreme Court's decision overturning Roe v. Wade, the song connects the ancient story of divine violation to contemporary issues of consent and women's rights over their own bodies. Film and television have periodically adapted these stories as well, though often with mixed results. The 1956 film Helen of Troy and the 2003 miniseries of the same name attempted to tell Helen's story with varying degrees of faithfulness to the source material. The 2004 film Troy, starring Brad Pitt as Achilles, largely stripped away the divine elements of the story, presenting a more grounded, historical version of the Trojan War, though it kept Helen as the catalyst for the conflict. The enduring appeal of these stories raises interesting questions about why they continue to resonate across such vast spans of time and cultural change. Part of it is certainly the dramatic power of the narratives themselves. These are stories of love, betrayal, revenge, sacrifice, and the relationship between humans and the divine. They explore fundamental questions about fate, free will, justice, and family obligation that remain relevant regardless of when or where they're told. But there's something else at work, too. These myths deal with the consequences of actions, showing how choices made in one moment can echo through generations. Zeus's decision to seduce Leda led directly to the Trojan War, which led to Agamemnon's sacrifice of Iphigenia, which led to Clytemnestra's revenge, which led to Orestes's matricide. Each action flows from what came before, creating a chain of cause and effect that feels almost inevitable in retrospect. This idea of inherited consequences, of children paying for the sins of their parents, is central to Greek tragedy and remains compelling today. We still grapple with intergenerational trauma, with how the choices of previous generations shape the world we inherit. The house of Atreus, cursed by crimes committed generations before Agamemnon was born, serves as a mythological exploration of how violence and injustice perpetuate themselves across time. The myth also deals with power and its abuses. Zeus's use of disguise to assault Leda, Agamemnon's sacrifice of his daughter for military advantage, Clytemnestra's murder of her husband, all these represent power being used by those who possess it against those who don't. These are uncomfortable stories that don't always provide clear moral lessons. Sometimes the victims become perpetrators. Sometimes revenge is justified, but still destructive. Sometimes there are no good choices, only terrible ones. Modern interpretations have particularly focused on the female characters in these stories, recognizing them as more than just plot devices or motivations for male heroes. Helen, who for centuries was blamed for the Trojan War, as if her beauty or her choices were somehow responsible for men's decision to fight, is increasingly seen as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Was she really free to refuse Paris when Aphrodite herself had promised her to him? Could any mortal resist a goddess's direct intervention? Clytemnestra, who murdered her husband in revenge for their daughter's death, embodies the impossible position of women in patriarchal societies. She had no legal recourse for Iphigenia's murder. Greek law and custom gave her no way to seek justice through official channels. Her only option for avenging her daughter was to take the law into her own hands, knowing it would ultimately cost her everything, including her life and her relationship with her surviving children. Even Leda herself, often overlooked in favor of her more famous children, deserves consideration as a character in her own right. She was assaulted by a god, forced to bear children from that assault, and then had to navigate the complex politics of raising offspring who were both mortal and divine. Whatever agency she possessed was severely constrained by her circumstances, yet she managed to raise 4 extraordinary children who would shape the Greek mythological world. The constellation Gemini, representing Castor and Pollux, serves as a permanent reminder of how these stories continue to surround us. Every night, weather permitting, we can look up and see those stars, brothers who loved each other so much that they chose to share immortality rather than be separated by death. It's a beautiful image, one that suggests love can transcend even the most fundamental boundaries of existence. As we reach the end of this journey through the myth of Zeus and Leda, what final lessons can we draw? Perhaps it's that actions have consequences that extend far beyond what we can imagine. Perhaps it's that beauty and power are double-edged gifts that can destroy as easily as they elevate. Perhaps it's that family bonds, whether biological or chosen, can be both the source of our greatest strength and our deepest wounds. Or perhaps the lesson is simpler. These stories endure because they speak to fundamental aspects of human experience. Love, jealousy, revenge, sacrifice, loyalty, betrayal. These aren't just themes in ancient myths. They're the stuff of life itself, the emotions and choices that define our existence. By exploring them through the medium of mythology, we gain perspective on our own experiences, seeing them reflected and magnified in these larger-than-life characters and their extraordinary circumstances. The story that began with a swan seeking shelter in a queen's arms ended with wishkshur, murder, madness, and ultimately a kind of resolution. Not a happy ending. Greek tragedy rarely offers those, but an ending that suggests cycles of violence can be broken, that justice, however imperfectly, can be achieved, and that even in the darkest stories, there are moments of genuine love and self-sacrifice that redeem the human, or in this case, the partly divine spirit. Zeus and Leda, through their brief and problematic union, gave the world some of its most enduring stories. Helen's beauty, the Dioscuri's loyalty, Clytemnestra's vengeance, all of these continue to inspire, horrify, and fascinate us thousands of years after they were first told around fires in ancient Greece. That's the true immortality, not the divine blood of Zeus or the constellation in the heavens, but the immortality of story, of characters and themes that speak across centuries to each new generation. If you've enjoyed this exploration of Zeus and Leda and their children's tragic destinies, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Greek mythology offers countless other stories worth exploring. Tales of love and war, heroes and monsters, gods and mortals intertwined in ways that continue to illuminate the human condition. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with ancient wonders and timeless truths.